Hello and welcome to episode 15, Space as a Default Infrastructure for National Security and Economy. To understand this issue, we have today with us Rose Croshier. Hi, Rose. Welcome to the
Hello.
podcast.
Good morning. So glad to be here.
Likewise, thank you very much for joining us and giving us your precious time. And I believe like today's topic is much more wider in scope, but is meant to actually not only educate the government, but also the non-space sector and how they can actually contribute to the economy and defense as well. So as we'll be taking a deep dive into this topic, prior to that, can you please provide us a brief overview of your career, the organizations that you're associated with, and in general, your journey in the space sector?
Sure. And I'd say my story is a bit unusual. I started out in the humanities. So history and French were part of my undergraduate foundation. Later, for graduate work, I did diplomacy and international commerce. So that's the academic foundation. But I also spent about 20 years in the US Air Force. There, I was exposed to space operations, but I spent half my career as a foreign area officer working primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, where I did a lot of program design and management. And then leaving the Air Force, I joined a think tank called the Center for Global Development based out of DC. And I worked there for a couple of years. And most recently, I joined the Department of Commerce in the Office of Space Commerce. Although in today, I'm speaking still in my capacity as a policy fellow with the Center for Global Development.
Amazing. I think that's a quite a multidisciplinary track record of the career, and I believe we don't really have much think tanks in the space sector. But glad to see such think tanks are now, which are not specializing in the space sector, but still taking an initiative and helping the people know about what is happening in the space industry. Definitely, then,
I,
without a
I,
delay, I think we can take a dive into the topic at the moment. So, as we have a broad audience also from defense and security fields, so can you tell us why space technology is essential for the modern world?
Absolutely. Space really, I would argue, is becoming normalized. It's another type of infrastructure that any country should use deliberately, like developing roads or establishing a good and stable electricity infrastructure. It's being used every day, regardless of there being a particular space policy or an office. It's just a matter of whether or not a particular country is being deliberate about it. So that is kind of the root of where I started in my research and my current work, making a case for normalizing space. Space, I think, often gets it in its own way. It's got such a cachet, the sort of science fiction glamour to it, that it's not really considered to be practical as a practical tool alongside any other tool you would use to develop your economy, or in our conversation, enhance its ability for defense.
Amazing. I think one point you mentioned about the rails and roads, and I'd like to actually tell our audience that there's a country called as Estonia in Europe. Most people, I mean, they are aware about Estonia, of course, but not much people in the South Asian region or the island nations. So Estonia is actually one of the countries which doesn't have its own satellite, but it utilizes space applications literally even for the trams, metros as well. So I believe, like, of course, later on we can make definitely an episode on this too. But yeah, let's continue with this exciting topic ahead. So, Rose, in general terms, can you tell us how space technology is instrumental in benefiting the nation's economic dimensions?
Yes. So essentially, if you're going to talk in terms of space technology, there are three major themes of applications. The first is position, navigation, and timing, which is essentially GPS or BeiDou. There's numerous constellations that provide that service, and it's free, essentially. So free data available globally from multiple constellations. There's remote sensing, very familiar. Probably we've all seen it, through Google Maps and other displays. And then also communications, and that can range from TV broadcasts to data backhauling to newer things like direct to the user services like SpaceX's Starlink. Combined, these capabilities support multiple sectors. Often this is talked about, in very futuristic terms, like the emerging 5G or even 6G enabled global Internet of Things. But I would say, today, these satellite capabilities, these applications are already baked into routine communications infrastructure, finance, farming. You can put this in, you can translate this to thinking about data backhauling. You can think about timing data for financial transfers used between different banks. You can think about weather forecasts and farmers using this. So it's not necessarily always a picture on a screen. This is data that is used and communicated in multiple ways, be it the radio or television or text between people discussing whether or not the roads are muddy or not. They need to transfer their goods from point A to point B. Really, this is decades old technology at this point. It's getting better and faster every day, but there are a lot of things a country can do to make it more accessible or more useful to that local economy. Also, I'd really argue that the benefits of space technology aren't just found in satellites themselves. We should consider the opportunities found in value-added services of all kinds that combine and localize this position, timing, and navigation data, various types of remote sensing data, and the ability to extend communications to remote locations or other situations to really address specific local problems. Problems, are, after all, just another way of saying business opportunities, I'd argue. A government can help this along by building good foundations for any sector. You talk about building schools, STEM programs, making financing more accessible, for example. But for leveraging space technology, a state can take additional discrete actions to make remote sensing and position navigation and timing data more useful, more accessible to the domestic economy by creating a regional specific spatial reference system. This can serve as a kind of bedrock for researchers, policymakers, and entrepreneurs to build upon, making it easier to integrate various kinds of data for numerous purposes. It may not be as glamorous as a new launch facility, but this kind of framework activity can really accelerate a local or regional economy.
Definitely. I think you mentioned one really, I would say it's a very essential point. And as you are associated with the think tank as well. So, do you believe in general the policy makers or the space policy has gained much more prominence after the new space era has kickstarted, where companies like SpaceX, OneWeb are coming in? So, do you believe like the policy makers have got a possible much more prominent role as compared to what it was before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for like any sector, policymakers, government has a role in encouraging its development, its expansion. So the foundational answer usually is, hey, you need to have a good education, a good school system, good STEM programs. You need to have accessible financing. All of these are examples of sort of the routine answer for any kind of infrastructure or economic growth. But I'd say for space technology in particular, a state can take some very discrete actions to make these kinds of space applications more accessible, more user by a wider community. So I'm a big fan. Well, everyone might jump to launching satellites or having a launch facility as the space thing to do, to be a space actor. I'm much more interested in those framework actions, those standards development, the policy and regulation that is really much more tangibly useful to a wider range of people and interests. So, for example, a country could start by creating a regional specific spatial reference system, and this would really act as a bedrock for a wide community, researchers, policymakers, entrepreneurs, where they don't have to build everything from scratch. They've got a foundation to kind of build upon. And this makes it much easier to integrate various kinds of data for numerous purposes. So it could be data that's gathered on the ground combined with, remote sensing data or other capabilities. It's not very, glamorous to get into this. It's not as fancy as a new launch facility or something, but it is much more practically, pragmatically useful for the community. This kind of framework can really accelerate a space economy and use of existing space capabilities in general.
Yes, I agree with you actually, because I think we have seen this one side where, the commercialization is increasing, policymakers are gaining prominence as well. And now we'll be actually looking at the other side, because our topic deals with both national security and economy. So, considering the growth of commercialization of the space industry, do you think this has also somewhat increased the concerns for national security?
Yes and no. I tend to think most about emerging space actors, so those that are just starting to use space technology. And so there's a lot of positive outcomes from having access to position navigation and timing, remote sensing data, and communications. Some applications used to be a purely national capability, so you did have to have a well-funded NASA-like entity or a large Department of Defense with the ability to do research and development and implement these technologies. But the commercial world has really flowered over the past couple of decades. So space as a service is more accessible than ever. So therefore, a country can, for example, concentrate their resources on developing what they maybe need very locally, or they consider to be most critical to have an independent capability, and they can, in a modular in a modular way, just go out and acquire the capabilities they need. So it's completely valid to mix and match what you need, to make best use of limited resources. So some of those capabilities for defense, you can use space to monitor extremely large areas at once, such as maritime territory, coastlines, borders, and particularly a smaller state that may have a modest size, a group of manpower to monitor a border, or maybe a limited number of ships. Having the ability to do this kind of large area of surveillance really makes your resources you have that much more valuable. You can use them, you can send them to the right place at the right time, as opposed to just kind of hoping you look out and catch an issue when you happen to be there. You can also use space to connect remote units, be it police or maritime or ground forces, connect equipment. It's there's just so many applications in the defense world that they're applicable, and they're all they can all be pretty, not so advanced that they're out of a sci-fi movie. These are almost routine. In general, any security force uses satellites in some way for reconnaissance and surveillance, even if it's just Google Maps and being able to draw a good concept of where the hills are that you have to plan for when you're going somewhere. When I was in the UN, I spent a year in the UN with the Democratic Republic of Congo with MONUSCO, the UN force there. We routinely use satellite data to build maps to get an idea about what was happening in very remote areas where we might only have a handful of blue helmets to respond. And we were probably using a tenth of the actual capability that's within the reach of an organization like the UN. And I think that's part of the reason why I started working in this realm, because I realized, my God, people just don't know what resources are at hand, and we need to invest more in that sort of implementation side, not just the data gathering side. But anyway, we use this kind of reconnaissance and surveillance data. I'm sure things like weather tracking, is it monsoon season or not? When is it going to end? Is there
Yes.
it's just kind of basic. And then communications and navigation are routine for any kind of planning activities or operations of all sorts. On the other side, this type of capability is now widely available really to anybody. So you can call that radical transparency or democratized intelligence. Frankly, it's just harder for a state to keep its secrets, behind its border. There's no rules saying, there's no international law saying that a satellite can't image, your territory as they're flying over. And in many ways, this is a very positive thing. It opens up it opens up the world to legitimate opportunities for desirable activity like scientific or market research. A negative note is that it's also available to criminals or other nefarious actors to understand what you or your forces are doing. So it's really a mixed bag, and it's best to at least understand that environment. You can't assume that countries don't have access to what's happening with your people or your land or your sea. at any given time.
Yes, I think a lot of this actually deals with the capability development, especially you mentioned about your experience in UN.
Mhm.
You were serving in the Republic of Congo, and I believe you also have a book that is going to release in next few days, I would say. So can you a little bit tell us about the book as well? Because I guess the audience will have a much more extended perspective after the hearing your podcast. They'll have a much more extended perspective to to get a copy of your book as well. So please, can you extend a little bit about what is your book and how it will help the readers to possibly consume the knowledge on the space capability development?
Sure. Yeah, of course. I'm very happy to do so. So as mentioned, you asked about my past, and I had this sort of foundation in space operations, and then I went on to do other kinds of work. And I think that time in the Congo was very formative because I kept seeing opportunities where space technology would be applicable, but my colleagues just weren't familiar enough with it to really be able to immediately absorb it. They would default naturally. People default to the things they're most familiar with because there's a lot to do and it's a high pressure environment. And I would say I saw a similar pattern with a lot of the program design and management and capability and capacity I was doing writ large in sub-Saharan Africa through my military career. So this stayed with me, and so I when I left the Air Force and I joined the Center for Global Development, I was very interested in putting into practical terms, how space could be used, no matter the budget, no matter the size. That there's a lot of opportunity there, given political will and some modest resources, you could really have an outsized return. So this needed to be written down, and that's what I spent a year and a half doing at the Center for Global Development. So on the 10th of May, we're going to be releasing a book called The Handbook for Space Capability Development. It is designed to be, ideally a pragmatic, relatively succinct handbook that walks through why any country should use space or should consider space as a resource, what that means. And I talk about a concept called foundational space capability. And that means really the ability to fully leverage existing space infrastructure first. Maybe, building a satellite or launching a small satellite of some sort is a very important component of a greater space capability capacity building effort, but it's not the main goal. You ideally launch a satellite to achieve something. You're trying to get unique data. You're trying to connect a particular area of your country that is currently unconnected. You are trying to expand or make local position navigation and timing more accurate for your particular geographic dynamics. That is the goal of a space program, and that is perfectly legitimate way to approach it. And then the third part is
Yes.
all about program design, and it's really kind of walking through the process of going from nothing to something, and then from something to something bigger and better in a very iterative way.
Yes. Thank you very much about this, extending about the book. And I would like to tell our audience that, I'll be putting up a link uh, below the description of this podcast, and so that you can access and see what is this book about, what is the event about in general. And you can, if you're around the uh, area of the venue, and you can actually attend this event in person as well. So yeah, continuing with the questions ahead. I think this question is actually related to what we were speaking about, the capability development. So in general, the defense is now at large looking towards acquiring satellite assets. For example, we have seen Space Development Agency, which is primarily contracting, managing the satellite assets and services from the commercial sector. So do you think defense sector also needs to educate itself on the technical aspects of the space domain to avoid allocating over budgets and utilize new space technologies in effective manner?
I would say all sectors of government need to be more familiar with space applications and space capabilities in general to normalize the use of space like any other tool. And I think it's also I don't know, it's a degree of developing specialization so that you have an expert at the table who can help you have a balanced conversation. So, for example, if you're a smaller country, a developing country that's trying to leverage space and is reaching out to the commercial community to find applicable uses for a reasonable price, having somebody at your table who has your interests purely in mind is very helpful to keep a balanced conversation and to make sure that you're actually getting what you need. That is a very important role, and I'd say one of the reasons why it's important for any country to have some kind of space program, and that may be just an advisor, like even a single person who dedicates his or her time to understanding a range of space applications and supporting the technology behind that, and generally what it takes to actually implement it is still super useful to enable that maybe policy to vendor conversation. And as maybe you grow that advisor into a small office and they're able to further specialize. So you maybe have someone who's got more depth in geospatial information systems in particular, and can help a department of some sort, be it defense or agriculture or education, to leverage that technology for that department's main purpose. So not everyone has to be a space expert, but a greater general familiarity is very useful. And then cultivating some experts within your own government who can facilitate a more technical conversation is a very good path to take.
I absolutely agree with this. The point that you firstly mentioned is all sectors of government need to be more familiar with space. I think because it's not only, of course, the defense is the prime consumer of the space resources, satellites as well, but there are several other sectors as well. For example, we see in the maritime domain, it's not only the defense. There are fishing vessels as well. I'm originally from India, so I'd like to actually tell this that we have a vast coastline, the Indian Peninsula, and it's an unfortunate thing that there have been several civilian incidents where possibly the vessels have been lost, or people, are lost somewhere in the sea. And one of the prime thing that is there, that the government observed the gap, is that there are no proper satellite resources or technology to actually help the coast guards to actually achieve that motive of safeguarding the people on the coast. So I think I completely agree with this point that you mentioned, that it needs to be there needs to be an awareness in all sectors of the government rather than only just defense. So
Yeah.
just actually following with this, I mean, I'm looking at this from a geopolitics and international security point of view. So there is a considerable amount of gap in the knowledge of space tech in both like defense and international affairs community. And given the fact that geopolitics is playing one of the I mean, it is one of the key factors in the development of space assets globally. So from your perspective, how can we educate the defense sector and the international affairs community about space technology? Because I believe geopolitics is playing a lot of key role these days to help, I mean, push the governments to invest in space.
Right. Well, I think so something's interesting about having both a development and defense background. The developing community tends to shy away when thinking about any capabilities used for defense, right? And the defense community doesn't think that deeply often about development, sustainable development goals. But the reality is, a country's motivation for developing a space capability is going to be a blend of both. It's no secret that security concerns may be a priority. Being particularly concerned about a particular border region, or a trend of piracy, or concern about the safety of fishermen in a particular treacherous waters. That might be the motivating thing that sort of concentrates political will, and to a degree some resources to make the implementation of space real. But it doesn't have to be for a single use. I mean, that dual use capability goes both ways. You might be, developing a program that is, concerned about maritime security, but you're also creating capabilities that protect fishermen who are getting lost. A couple of notes. AIS is the signal coming off of ships that was originally used to help ships find each other, not run into each other, essentially when they're in close proximity near a port. But having this signal on is something that satellites were able to detect. And this flipped over from a government program to a publicly available data set that the UN essentially endorsed for safety. And so any ship that has over a certain tonnage is supposed to have their AIS signal on and broadcasting. And this enables, maritime, be it forces or monitoring entities, to be able to see what ships are moving around in their economic zone or near their shores. And this is amazing. But that combined with weather data and understanding about ocean currents can also be really revolutionary to support safety. So if there's a ship that is broadcasting and the broadcast goes off and that sort of triggers an interest, and then because we understand the currents of the ocean better because of, again, more remote sensing data, then we're able to predict, like, well, where could this potentially, in distress ship end up? So you end up putting together these various pieces of data in new ways that have a lot of uses.
Definitely. I think the one of the important points you mentioned is about the combination of data, especially the weather that you mentioned. We can combine it with weather. And I believe a lot of this deals with the Earth observation applications. And I guess there can be a separate episode on this where we can actually discuss how the combination of data, of course, in that the space data as well, can revolutionize the industries in different sectors. Like we are at the moment in satellite communication, we are observing this with the hybrid communications. In Earth observation, there are companies which are doing like hybrid usage of both the drones and the satellite images. If, for example, there are several companies on a local scale who don't have a market share beyond a certain region. For them, I think this is a good way to utilize the space data. But yeah, definitely there can be a different episode on this. And I believe like we are actually at the end of the episode now. So finally, Rose, I would like to ask you as a space technology expert, what message would you like to give to the government and the defense sector about the space technology, especially in terms of, educating themselves about space and to utilize it effectively for
Sure.
the welfare of the community?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I guess my first message would be, ironically, space just isn't that special. It's been around for a few decades and it hasn't been necessarily fully leveraged. So it needs to be considered with a practical, pragmatic eye. How can we use this to advance whatever our national objectives are? And I would say, to put it in more well-grounded terms, for an economy, for example, many regional development banks do studies to say, hey, where are your economic constraints? Like, where does your economy need to, what would you need to work on in order to help your economy to thrive? And, common bottlenecks are lack of internet connectivity, for example, but there's a whole laundry list, usually well researched and done in collaboration with an in-country team, right? So it's not just someone helicoptering from somewhere else to proclaim what your issues are. It's built together ideally. So you say, hey, this is it, and bringing space as another tool to the table, or bringing a space expert to the table, can really help you find, well, where are the cost-effective ways we could address this particular gap? What portions of our value-added applications that can we encourage our local economy to address? So for example, if there's a particular connectivity issue with a particular region, that could be a contest you inspire at a local university, saying like, hey, help us address this particular thing, and keep space on your list of things to consider when you're talking about way to address it. You can put out a possible offer for a contract, if there's a company that can provide a solution. I mean, you can come with some pretty creative ways that include space to go after very concrete things that are identified by other sectors. I mean, I think the space community tends to be a little too insular, tend to look at each other or look inward and talk about how great space is, which we all, I mean, I'm one of them. I totally agree. But I think we should be more outward facing. And in addition to doing our own space conferences, show up to that water management conference, show up to that planning session for border security and talk about how these things apply to those problem sets, without forcing everyone to become, a self-driven expert, right? And so, this talks about, like, what is that knowledge gap? And I'd say, uh, general orientation. As much as you know about how highways work, you should have a general idea about how satellites work. It's kind of adding as a plank of sort of foundational training and orientation for any, planner, city planner, policy planner, educator. Like, all of these professionals should have at least a little bit in their academic foundation that addresses space. And then lastly, I'd say, not every country needs NASA. You don't have to be able to do everything. You really can design and focus a program to make investments that are targeted to provide the most return. So it doesn't necessarily make sense for every country to have a launch facility. Maybe they have, particularly great location on Earth to support, polar satellites, polar orbiting satellites to download data before they flip around to the next hemisphere. There's a lot of natural resources and capability that can be leveraged that are more specific to your particular advantages. So I just encourage countries to even form a small planning team, run through what the possibilities are, and then make an investment that is iterative. So you may start with a seed and then kind of grow steadily over a decade, to something that is more what you're ideally going for, but in a sustainable, organic way.
Absolutely. I think the addressing the knowledge gap is very important, as you mentioned. And I believe we have a large amount of audience from the United States, but we are also now gradually building up the audience from the Asian, Latin American, and the African region for the podcast. And this is my whole motive for the podcast, is to address the knowledge gap, help people become more aware about the space technology, not only in the international affairs community, but defense, economic, and other sectors as well. So Rose, thank you again for the wonderful insights. And I believe that there have been, I think, a lot of questions that have popped up during the discussion, and I believe we can definitely do some follow-up episodes in future. And yeah, please feel free to also tell about your book. Lastly, because as I mentioned, we have quite a lot of audience from the United States. So if some of our audience is willing to come for this event, they can definitely come.
Thank you, Omkar. It's been such a pleasure and such an honor to have this opportunity to talk about this. So details for the Handbook for Space Capability Development will be officially released on the 10th of May at the Center for Global Development headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have an open invite. It includes breakfast. Please go to cgdev.org, and you can find general information about it there. You can also attend virtually. I plan to provide a lightning presentation of space capability development, so a very compressed version with graphics, which should be pretty fun. And then we'll have a really incredible moderated discussion with the Africa Space Development Institute, with representatives from the Secure World Foundation, myself. It's going to be a great and relatively short event. So I hope anyone who's interested, please do join us.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Rose, again for the your time and wonderful insights. I'll be actually adding the links to the event and the other related links that Rose will be forwarding me below the description section of the podcast. Thank you, Rose. Have a good day.
My pleasure. Thank you.